Longtime TUSD school board member Mark Stegeman on why he chose to call it quits.
There are many things that in retrospect I would do differently.
Arizona's superintendent of public instruction on her first year in office and challenges ahead.
There are major issues in education we need to work on, so let's not get distracted, let's stay focused on the real problems.
A nurses union in Tucson weighs its next steps after a one-day strike.
I really feel like it empowered the nurses.
Hello and welcome to Arizona 360. I'm Lorraine Rivera. Thank you for joining us. This week, the search began to fill a vacancy on the board for the Tucson Unified School District. Mark Stegeman announced his resignation last week. Voters first elected him in 2008, and he won re-election twice. With 15 months left to go in his current term, he explains why this was the time to step down.
It's partly my family obligations, which have increased a lot, and it's partly a sense that I may not be able, although I think we've made a lot of progress, I think it's hard to see where we're going to get to where I envisioned the district, which is really to be the best district in the county. I've always felt like that was possible, that we have the assets, and that's still possible, but the road looks very challenging.
You've been on the board 11 years, but there's been a number of superintendents, and school boards actually have more responsibility than probably most of the public actually realize. Did you get some things done under the leadership shifts that kept occurring?
I think part of the problem is that school boards, including ours, sometimes don't take enough time picking a superintendent. It's really something that should be a huge effort. It is indeed the most important decision the board makes, and I don't think the board historically has treated it as the most important decision. And of course, if you don't make the right choice at the beginning, then you lead yourself into all kinds of trouble and difficult decisions later.
Partisan politics get in the way of action within TUSD school board?
I think it does to some extent. The board is very intertwined with Democratic Party politics, and I think that influences outcomes to some extent. I'm an independent. I think ideally the board would be highly nonpartisan. I think it needs a business voice as well as an educator voice, and I think it needs people that are focused on education and not on external politics, as much as has been true. I'll move that we...
A university professor, Stegeman is proud of what he has been able to accomplish, including spearheading the district's self-insurance health plan that bumped up cash reserves by millions. The board mandate to increase instructional spending and decrease administrative cost, uncovering the so-called blacklist, a list of some 1,400 district employees and stakeholders deemed problematic, the introduction of an internal auditor, and opening up the top-performing university high school to out-of-district students.
The community needs to make a decision. Do they want TUSD, does it want TUSD to be a strong, really much improved district? And if the community wants that, it's going to have to elect a strong board with a common vision that gets a superintendent that shares that vision and is willing to break some china. It's not going to be easy. It can be done, but it won't be easy. And I don't know if the will is there. There is not the will in the current management structure. Dr. Trujillo has not been a radical reform superintendent, but that's partly because the current board or the previous board would not accept a radical reform superintendent. It has to start with the board and include the superintendent, but it's going to require a lot of strength.
Why do you suppose that hasn't been able to occur prior to this?
Well, I think there have been specific issues where even a modest reform provoked tremendous resistance from the particular interests that would be affected by it or negatively affected. And this is typical in all levels of politics, that the vested interest that is negatively affected protests so loudly with such impact that even some modest reforms don't go through.
Nonetheless, he's hopeful about TUSD's future.
I have many, many friends in TUSD. I wish them well, and there has been progress and there will continue to be progress. The buck on everything stops with the board, and every time something bad happens in TUSD, whether or not I could realistically control it, it weighs heavily, and it's I have to admit, a relief to be free of that.
There's some solace in knowing that you're leaving and you've done what you thought you could in the time that you spent on the board.
Well, I could have done better. I accomplished quite a few things, I think. When I went to make a list, I was surprised because you sort of forget over time. But there are many, many more things that weren't accomplished, and there are many things that in retrospect I would do differently. Issues that could have been managed better, battles that probably were unwinnable and shouldn't have been fought, battles that were winnable that maybe should have been fought and weren't. So I have regrets, but I'm still proud of some of the progress that we made, a lot of the progress that we made.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
After her inauguration in January, Arizona's Superintendent of Public Instruction, Kathy Hoffman, says she hit the ground running. A political newcomer and educator herself, much of the focus early on concerned whether the Democrat could get her message across the aisle. While she managed to rally support for some of her causes, conservatives took aim at others. Hoffman recently sat down with me at Arizona Public Media to reflect on her time in office so far. If you had to say there's been one accomplishment during this nearly 1 year, what would it be?
There's many that I'm very proud of. One I would love to highlight is the focus on the social emotional supports of our students, because far too many of our students have experienced some sort of trauma in their life and are coming to school dealing with mental health challenges. But I would say as an accomplishment that it feels like the stars are aligning. We're getting lots of federal funding, state funding to support the social emotional well-being of our students. And for example, one achievement was the additional $20 million of new funding for school safety positions, which does include school counselors and social workers. And our department is in the process of allocating out that $20 million.
Recently, one of Arizona's revenue streams for education funding suffered a setback. A U.S. district judge ruled the voter-approved Prop 123 broke federal law because it raised the amount of money taken from the state land trust without Congress's okay. Arizona took an additional $2 billion out of the trust for education after the measure passed in 2016. Because Governor Ducey's office plans to appeal, Hoffman says it's difficult to predict the ruling's impact. She adds that the issue underscores a bigger problem in the state.
Prop 123 is another Band-Aid fix. I know it's approximately $200 per student that Prop 123 is allocating, but it's a drop in the bucket. When it comes to school funding, we need to look across the entire state, identify those inequities that we see, and make sure that every school, every child has the resources they need to be successful.
Last November, Hoffman became the first Democrat elected to her post in over 2 decades. She believes her experience working in schools as a speech pathologist gave her the ability to communicate her ideas across a Republican-led legislature and remain open to their feedback.
I think listening is a huge part of being a leader, and that's one thing I saw was the need for more communication and sitting down together, getting to know each other, and finding ways to focus on the solutions and not get caught up in controversial issues where, to me, that's a distraction. We need to stay focused on, there are major issues in education we need to work on, so let's not get distracted, let's stay focused on the real problems.
As you look into the next year, what will be some of your priorities?
So my background as an educator is, as I mentioned, as a speech therapist working in special education, and I cannot tell you how many times as I've traveled the state that I've been offered a job, because we still have many openings for special education positions, both special education teachers as well as other specialist positions. And we're also seeing that with the increased cost of special education services, that our schools are underfunded for special education services. So that is an area for this next legislative session that I think there's actually a good amount of bipartisan support. There's been a lot of working groups around how can we properly fund special education, and that's an issue I'm very passionate about, because we know that our students with disabilities are often some of our most disadvantaged.
Beyond her support for increased funding for public education, Hoffman says her office is also taking a closer look at health care benefits and how much teachers pay for coverage.
In fact, many of our teachers are, from year to year, have been paying more and more for their health care benefits, which is actually taking away from their paychecks. So we need to look at the whole picture holistically and understand that the pay is one piece of it, but also looking at their benefits. Their teachers are required to pay about 12% into retirement every single paycheck. It's mandatory. So so there's a lot of other pieces to the pay and benefits issue, and we want to make sure that we're also regionally competitive with other neighboring states like New Mexico and Utah, which right now we're not, or Texas. Like you can still move to one of our neighboring states and easily make over $10,000 more. So we just need to be aware of the regional trends and where we stand.
Okay, Superintendent Hoffman, thank you.
Thank you so much.
In a state where union membership falls well below the national average, lately unions have made waves in a number of industries, from healthcare to mining and even journalism. We took a closer look at some of the issues involved. But first, employment attorney Barney Holtzman offered insight on the role of unions and workers' rights in Arizona. Remind us, right to work state, what that means here in Arizona.
So a right to work state means that the employer cannot force the employees to be members of a union to work at their place. Okay. So right to work really only deals with the union workforce. A lot of people confuse it with an at-will state, which Arizona is an at-will state, which means that your employment relationship can be terminated with or without cause and with or without notice. Okay.
Right now there's a conversation about unions in Arizona. There are in fact unions in Arizona, but not every industry has them, correct?
That's correct. The National Labor Relations Act is what governs unions and the unionization of workforces. It covers all private employees other than some areas of transportation and some areas in agriculture. So any industry that is not those specific ones are allowed to unionize, but it requires a vote of the membership of the employees to say we want a union to represent our interests. Instead of us having a one-on-one relationship with the employer, we want a union to represent us in terms of setting our pay, our benefits, the terms and conditions of employment.
How does the workplace change once an industry is not a union and then becomes one? I mean, is there a difference in the environment?
So it can change the environment. At that time, once a union is in place, they have to bargain with the employer. And so you have representatives, and that's what you see in the news today going on at the hospitals with the nurses, is their union is negotiating with the hospital about what the terms and conditions are going to be. What are we going to pay our employees? How many breaks are they going to get? How many vacation days will they get? And then the relationship is managed through that contract that is created. It's called a collective bargaining agreement, as well as through the system that is created in that. So oftentimes, instead of things being determined by the employer specifically how they're going to deal with the situation, they look to what the contract says. And the contract says, for this violation, for example, here is the punishment that will happen to the employee.
Among the terms we've heard in this conversation are an employer has to provide basics in the workplace. What constitutes basics in the workplace?
So there are very little in Arizona. A lot of it is based on state law in terms of what are the basics. For example, one thing that I know a lot of people are always surprised by is that employers do not have to give you a break. In Arizona, there's no requirement of a mid-morning break. There's no requirement of a lunch break or anything like that. And so the real requirements are that you have to pay the minimum wage and you have to pay overtime if the employee doesn't qualify for an exemption from the overtime requirements. You have to provide a safe working environment. Yeah. And that's pretty much, I think, the minimum requirements in Arizona.
Sometimes employers have been known to say things, if you don't want to do this work, I can find someone who will, or if the pay is not appropriate for you, there's someone else out there chomping at the bit. That may not be tactful, but it is done. Is it legal?
It is not tactful and it's not good for morale, but it is generally legal as long as what the person is complaining about is their pay or some conditions of employment. And if it's just them individually saying, I don't like my pay, that's where we get to that at-will work state. And you're an at-will employee. If you don't like that, then you can quit or if you come back to work, then you're under that. Now, if you bond together with your coworkers and you come to your employer together, and the three of us, for example, three people come and say, we don't like the way you're doing this, and you say, as an employer, well, I'm sorry, leave. You may have very well violated the National Labor Relations Act, which says you as an employee can bind together with your coworkers and come and complain about the terms and conditions of employment. And that's called what we call concerted activity. They're working together to complain about terms and conditions of employment, and they're protected by the National Labor Relations Act, even though they haven't formed an official union. In a sense, that's their own little union, so to speak.
After nurses at St. Joseph's and St. Mary's hospitals unionized last fall, 11 months later in September, they formed a picket line and went on strike for a day amid ongoing talks on their first contract with the hospital's owner, Tenet Healthcare.
When you walked on that picket line, everyone had this sense of pride. Definitely, I really feel like it empowered the nurses.
Registered nurse Christine Valenzuela began working at St. Mary's 8 years ago.
It sounds so cliche, but it's what I was meant to do. And something that really appealed to me with the union is the strong patient advocacy that they achieve because of collective action.
She and nearly 75% of the nurses at St. Joseph's and St. Mary's voted to join the National Nurses Organizing Committee, National Nurses United, establishing Arizona's first nurses union with nearly 900 members. Today, she's part of the committee in negotiations. While she did not want to disclose specifics about their demands, a release from National Nurses United said nurses want hospital management to invest in nursing staff, to improve recruitment and retention, and bring down the number of patients assigned to a single nurse.
There's been very strong evidence, research that shows that there's a clear link between optimal staffing levels and patient outcomes. So overall, it is our goal to ensure that those patients are receiving optimal care.
Last month's picket extended from coast to coast. The union strike involved 6,500 nurses at a dozen Tenet hospitals in California, Arizona, and Florida. National Nurses members also went on strike outside the University of Chicago Medical Center. Tenet declined a request for an interview, but sent a statement that said in part, quote, "We are disappointed that the union undertook a strike in Tucson, which in our view was not constructive or necessary. St. Joseph's and St. Mary's hospitals continue to provide quality, compassionate care during the one-day strike."
We took all necessary legal steps to notify the hospital, give them ample opportunity. There was a 10-day notice by law that we provided. And in those 10 days, the hospital had plenty of time to make appropriate arrangements to make sure that the qualified staff was in the hospital, that patients were cared for.
As negotiations continue between the nurses and Tenet, this week newsroom staff at the Arizona Republican Phoenix voted whether or not to form their own union. Talks began at the start of the year after the company laid off 2 employees. That's according to Perry Vandell, a reporter at the paper. Just prior to that vote, he spoke to us via Skype about why he supports unionizing.
I had been laid off in 2015. I had worked there for probably about 9 months and was hired back in 2017, but I know personally how devastating it can be to be laid off from the paper that you love so much. I had 0 notice. I had maybe 2 weeks of severance, and my health insurance would be gone by the end of the month. And so what we're trying to do is give people more notice, a longer runway, and fight against layoffs when they do inevitably occur.
Throughout the state of Arizona, there's been obviously quite a bit of press about this issue. What sorts of challenges has this presented for you and your colleagues in the newsroom currently?
So we've gotten some pushback from management. The idea that the union is some kind of outside third party that isn't speaking for everyone, which just isn't true. Really, what we're trying to do is preserve local journalism and preserve it from these job cuts. As I'm sure you're aware, Gatehouse is set to buy Gannett and has publicly spoken about $300 million in cuts. And those cuts have to come from somewhere and will likely come from our own newsroom. And so the best thing we can do is to organize and fight against that when that does occur.
What ultimately do you want out of all this?
We want a stronger newsroom that advocates for its community and produces quality journalism like it has for the past 129 years.
Ultimately, staff voted to establish the Arizona Republic Guild. According to data from the U.S. Department of Labor, as of 2018, about 5% of workers in the state belong to a union. While that rate doubles nationally, Valenzuela remains optimistic that Arizona can catch up.
But definitely 2019, times are changing. People are really fighting for themselves and their rights, and nurses are stepping up to the plate. I truthfully don't want to stop at just St. Mary's and St. Joe's. I want to work on Arizona and get these hospitals unionized.
As uncertainty looms over the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimates over 700,000 workers in Arizona depend on free trade and keeping trade routes open. Professor Jeff Cusick studies trade law at the U of A School of Government and Public Policy and says deals like NAFTA are about creating stability in the marketplace.
There are a few interesting changes. So there have been updates to existing provisions relating to environmental standards and labor rights. There are also a couple of new elements of the deal, things that weren't as relevant, frankly, when the original NAFTA was negotiated. So rules relating to e-commerce, some more robust intellectual property rights provisions, something that the Trump administration obviously cares a lot about. He's mentioned that as part of his justification for current policies toward China, for example. So there are some changes, but the vast majority of the treaty text looks a lot like the original NAFTA.
You mentioned labor and the environment. That's not to say that those issues were not a factor in the previous NAFTA agreement, correct?
So NAFTA was one of the first modern trade deals to have a lot of detailed provisions relating to the environment and labor. Now those are relatively standard in trade deals around the world, but NAFTA was really ahead of its time in that regard. Now there's a difference between having rules and actually having enforceable standards with which member countries comply. And there's always been a question mark over whether labor rights provisions, for example, in a trade deal actually have any positive effects for your average worker, whether that's in the United States or Canada or Mexico. And I think a lot of labor watchdogs and organized labor organizations would say that those provisions of the NAFTA text were always basically lip service and didn't do a lot of good.
Who's ultimately the gatekeeper to ensure it's handled differently this time around?
Well, there's a question mark over enforcement in any trade deal. So that's a really great question, and that was one of the key sticking points in the recent negotiations. So one thing the Trump administration really wanted was to remove Chapter 19 of the original NAFTA agreement. Now, Chapter 19 relates to how disputes between the member countries get settled. Trump wanted to do away with the principal dispute settlement provisions. Canada stood firm on that, so dispute settlement remained in the updated deal. But that's the principal enforcement mechanism. When countries allege that someone's violating the terms of the agreement, they can sue one another under Chapter 19 of the NAFTA text.
Had that ever happened under the current NAFTA?
Yeah, so the United States, as we've heard a lot from the Trump administration, gets sued quite frequently under international trade law. That includes NAFTA, activating NAFTA provisions. It also includes activating provisions of the World Trade Organization in Geneva. So the Trump administration has actually been correct to point out that the United States is sued more often than any other country in the world. It's worth pointing out that the U.S. also initiates disputes against other countries more often than anyone else. So we're participating in both directions or on both sides of the case.
In this trade deal, the automotive industry has been a robust component. Does it increase under this new one, or does it remain pretty similar?
So there are stronger automotive provisions in USMCA. The most notable one, or the one we hear the most about, is that 40% of cars sold in the United States have to be made by automotive workers who are earning at least $16 an hour. There are a couple of different ways to interpret that rule. One is that it might sound like good news for organized labor because it implies some kind of minimum wage has been introduced. 40% of the car has to be made by somebody making $16 an hour sounds good. It's actually thinly veiled trade protection because your average Mexican auto worker makes far, far less than that. It's unlikely that they're going to get a raise up to that $16 an hour. So it's essentially a rule designed to keep U.S. car jobs in the United States.
How does USMCA impact Arizona differently than NAFTA did?
Well, there are a couple of interesting things that are relevant for Arizona in particular. If we think back to the original debates over NAFTA in the late 80s, early 90s, one of the major sticking points was what are NAFTA's effects going to be on immigration? So NAFTA supporters said it's going to create economic opportunity, it's going to generate wealth, it's going to make workers in all three countries better off, and that it will reduce immigration across the US-Mexico border. The critics of the deal said the opposite's going to be true, that having a free trade deal is going to increase immigration because it's going to open the border to trade, and by extension it's going to allow for more migration. And the data on this is actually mixed. We saw a large uptick in immigration from Mexico into the United States in the first 5 to 10 years after NAFTA was created. Since then it's plateaued rather dramatically. So immigration, it remains a big issue when we're talking about free trade in North America.
Because USMCA appears to be in a holding pattern here in the United States at least, what becomes of the current trade agreement in NAFTA as it is right now?
Well, there's a question mark right now over whether USMCA is even going to be ratified. So in the US Congress, there's a decision to be made about whether a democratically held House wants to, on the one hand, give Trump a political victory by ratifying USMCA, or deny Trump a victory at the expense of leaving this question mark over whether free trade is going to remain intact in the region. And most people, I think, would argue that having some deal is better than having no deal. And we've seen what the uncertainty around the current trade wars is doing to the US economy. We've seen what the uncertainty during USMCA negotiations is doing to the US economy. So I think failure to ratify a deal is going to be very bad news for the country and including the state of Arizona.
Okay, Dr. Jeff Cusick from the U of A School of Government and Public Policy. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's all for now. Thanks for joining us. To get in touch, visit us on social media or send an email to arizona360@azpm.org. We'll see you next week.